Bright Duty. Every student matters.
Now, non-aligned moment. Although the non-alignment movement formally came into existence in 1961, it had begun soon after the Second World War. In 1947, India hosted a conference of the leaders of Asian nations, and at this conference, Jawaharlal Nehru declared, "We of Asia propose to stand on our own legs and we do not intend to be the playing of others." And in 1955, the President Sukarno of Indonesia convened a conference of 29th Asian and African countries of Bandung. The Belgrade Conference 1961. The first summit of non-aligned nations was held in Belgrade, the capital of former Yugoslavia, in December 1961, and the conference was attended by the leaders of 25 non-aligned nations and observers from 3 other countries. Among the founders of non-aligned movement, special mention is made of 3 outstanding leaders: India's Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Amal Abdel Nazir of Egypt, and Yugoslavia's Joseph Tito. An impetus was given to this movement by the first president of Indonesia, Dr. Sukarno, from 1945 to 65, and the first prime minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, also. 27-point declaration. At this conference, a 27-point declaration was adopted in which world superpowers were urged to maintain peace and security in the world, and this conference condemned colonialism in all its forms, and through this declaration an appeal was made for total disarmament. And what strengthened the non-alignment movement? The following factors played a major role in the origin and later strengthening of the non-alignment movement. Reaction against Cold War and the system of military alliances. The concept of non-alignment arose as a reaction against Cold War and the military alliances. The race for arms had given rise to the possibility of a third world war. And then need for peace and economic development. That is, newly independent nations of Asia, Africa needed economic and technical assistance from both the power blocks. Actually, the thing is, these countries were struggling as they were newly independent countries and they actually wanted aid from these superpowers. So instead of joining them as in blocks, they just wanted economic and technical assistance from these blocks. Cooperation among the founding fathers of non-alignment movement, Nehru, Tito, Nazir, Nkrumah, coolly and calmly handled international situations, and this gave stability and strength to non-aligned movement. Now, growth of non-aligned movement was like with the passage of time, the number of non-aligned nations kept on rising. At the first summit held in Belgrade, 25 member states took part, whereas in 2016, at the 17th summit held at Margarita Island Peninsula, 120 member nations participate, because these are the nations which was sometime like at the previous time they were LDCs, like least developed countries, but now they are on the path of growth, so they did not want to involve themselves in these kind of problematic situations, so that otherwise they would have other challenges in their countries. Now, the non-aligned movement is a movement of 115 members representing the interests and priorities of developing countries. The movement has its origin in the Asia-Africa Conference held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. And these are the 5 founder members. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, 47-64, made efforts for Asian unity, decolonization, nuclear disarmament, advocated peaceful coexistence, securing world peace also. And Mr. Tito, he was the President of Yugoslavia, and he was from 1945 to 1980, fought against Germany in World War II, and communist, maintained some distance from the Soviet Union, forced united in Yugoslavia. And third one is Abdul Nazir, and from 1952 to 1970, he espoused the causes of Arab nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism, and nationalized the Suez Canal, leading to an international conflict in 1956. And Sukarno, first president of Indonesia, and he led the freedom struggle, espoused the causes of socialism and anti-imperialism, and organizing the Bandung Conference, overthrown in a military coup. And Kwame Nkrumah, 1909 to 72, he was the first Prime Minister of Ghana and led the freedom movement, advocated the cause of socialism and African unity. Now, the cooperation among these five countries and their leaders are like they are dramatic entry of many newly decolonized African countries in the international arena, and then growing Cold War tensions and its widening areas. Cooperation, the dramatic entry, and the growing Cold War. NAM was easier to define in terms of what it was not. The policy of staying away from alliances should not be considered isolation or neutrality, and non alignment is not isolation. Since isolationism means remaining aloof from world affairs, but it was not like that. The people, those who were with NAM, they were not isolated. Isolationism sums up the foreign policy of the US from the American War of Independence in 1787 up to the beginning of the First World War. And the non alignment is also not neutrality. Neutrality refers the principle of a policy of staying out of war, state practicing neutrality are not required to help end of a war, and they do not get involved in wars and do not take any position on the appropriateness or morality of a war. Now, what were the features of non-aligned movement? Not to align to any of the power blocs, USA and Soviet Union, to oppose any kind of military alliances like NATO, Seattle, Warsaw Pact, etc. Freedom to take its independent decisions, not to remain aloof from the international problems and politics, and also to judge an issue on merit and uphold, defend the right to of all people for freedom and justice. As for all these features, non-alignment movement, just because the countries were struggling with their own challenges as they were newly independent countries. As I take an example of India, India had some other challenges, like we had a challenge of population, poverty, unemployment, uneducation, and moreover, the basic amenities to be provided to the people like food, shelter, clothing. So at that time, it was a very good decision not to be added in any of the blocks. Objectives of NAM, which eliminates all causes which could lead to war and to protect nascent freedom of newborn independent countries of Asia and Africa from colonial domination, and to oppose colonialism, imperialism, and racial discrimination. Otherwise, we would have been in some other trouble. So, encourage friendly relations among countries, to advocate peaceful settlement of international disputes, to oppose use of force and use of nuclear weapons, to strengthen United Nations as an organ of the world peace, and to protect human rights and protect environment, to build a new international economic order, that is NEIO, and based on equality, equity, and justice. Now, growth of non-aligned movement, with the passage of time, the number of non-aligned nations kept on rising, and at the first summit held in Belgrade, 25 member states took part, whereas in 2016, at the 17th summit held at Margarita Island, Venezuela, 120 member nations participated. Now, the new International Economic Order, NIEO. New international economic order means the new international economic order was the idea of sustained economic development proposed by the newly decolonized countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Since most of these nations shared history of being ruled by the colonial power, they did not want to affiliate to any the superpower. They instead worked towards that economic development without being independent on richer nations. And the following are the reforms proposed by the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development Report in 72. Give the LDCs, that is least developed countries, control over the natural resources exploited by the developed Western countries, and obtain access for the LDCs to the Western market, so that LDCs could sell their products and therefore make it more beneficial for poor countries, and reduce the cost of technology from the Western country, and provide the LDCs with a great role in international economic institutions. Now, what was India's role during the Cold War? India took particular care staying away from the two alliances. India raised its voice against the newly decolonized countries from the becoming part of these alliances. India was in favor of actively intervening in world's affair to be soften Cold War rivalries, and Indian leaders and diplomats were often used to communicate and mediate. India chose to involve other members of the NAM in this mission, and India repeatedly tried to activate those regional and international organizations which were not a part of the alliances led by the US and the USSR. How served India's interest? First, non-alignment allowed India to take international decisions and stances. The served its interest rather than the interest of the superpowers and the allies. And then, second, India was often able to balance superpower against the other. And if India felt ignored or unduly pressurized by one superpower, it could tilt towards an other, and neither alliance system could take India for granted or bully it. India's alignment was said to be unprincipled in the name of pursuing its national interest, and India often refused to take firm stand on crucial international socials. And sometimes India took contradictory postures, having criticized others for joining alliances. And Indians signed the Treaty of Friendship in August 1971 with the USSR for 20 years. And during Bangladesh crisis, also India developed good relationship even with US in the name of diplomatic and military support. Now, NAM stress on international economic order. At the first NAM summit in Belgrade 61, economic issues were not very important. And the issues such as arms race and freedom of Afro-Asian nations in 1970s. However, the non-aligned movement stressed the need for new international economic order. And at the Algarve summit in 1973, the NAM orders attacked the multinational companies. At the Havana summit in 1979, it was demanded the strong measures should be taken to bridge the widening gap between the developing and the developed countries. And the seventh summit 1983 was held in New Delhi. And the NAM leaders, especially Saint Indira Gandhi, cautioned all nations against two big dangers. First, the unjust economic order, and the second, danger of the nuclear war. And at the summits held at Kuala Lumpur, Havana, Tehran, Margarita Islands in Venezuela, the NAM leaders were called for a reform of these three institutions: an International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, World Trade Organization. These institutions should be geared to the advantage of the developing nations. Now, the major conflicts during Cold War era. The Korean War, a police action, and the mine theory. Kim Il sung is the leader of North Korea, and Syngman Rhee, president of South Korea. The Korean War. Following World War II, the Allies divided Korea and the 38th parallel, and Soviet controlled North Korea. US set up a democracy in South Korea, and both governments claimed to control all over the Korea. And on June 15th, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and United Nations forces under MacArthur came to the aid of South Korea, and the communist forces pushed United Nations forces to brink of defeat, and United Nations forces pushed North Korean back to border of China. And also, war ends up at statesmen's like an armistice was signed ending war in July 1953, and Korea was divided at 38 parallel. And Korea War marked an important turning point in the World War. US began a major military building up and began using military force to prevent spread of communism. Cuban Missile Crisis. Like, Cuban was an ally of the Soviet Union. Ally means they were getting diplomatic and financial aid from them, and received diplomatic and financial aid from 1962. The leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, placed nuclear mission missiles in Cuba for converting into Russian base. And 3 weeks later, America became aware that Kennedy ordered American warships to intercept any Soviet ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USSR. And the Cuban Missile Crisis was a high point which came to known as the Cold War. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, US and Russia came extremely close to nuclear war, and when Russian placed and nuclear missiles in Cuba in November of 1962, and in response to US missiles in Turkey, the Russian began building missile bases in Cuba. And the United States places as embargo and incoming shipments to Cuba, and from the Soviet Union, US goes to DEFCON 3. Soviet ships reach the quarantine line but receive radio orders from Moscow to hold their positions. Cuban Missile Crisis, like Kennedy threatens a US invasion of Cuba unless Soviet missiles are removed, and US moves on DEFCON. And the Russians agreed to take their missiles out of Cuba if the US removed theirs Turkey. See how this is being done. Like here, these are the medium range missiles, but it was major uh, medium missile. Now let's revise a few questions. Bipolarity, division of the world into two power blocks, USA and USSR, and then the policy of non-alignment movement. Why did India sign the 20-year Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the Soviet Union? Non-alignment means non-joining any superpower, but it doesn't mean that a country for being prepared to its own difference, and therefore India signed to treaty with the Soviet Union in order to counter the US Pakistan China axis. So this treaty assured India Soviet support, and it is country faced attack also. Is NAM neutral? Non-alignment cannot be referred to as neutrality because neutrality refers to policy of staying away from the war, and NAM is a concept opposed to be belligerency, and it is concept aiming an independent, foreign, and peaceful coexistence. And what was the strength of non-aligned countries as the mediators between the superpowers? The strength of the non-aligned countries as mediator between the superpowers was based on their unity and their resolve to remain non-aligned despite the attempts by the two superpowers to bring them into alliances. Explain the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the year 1962, the Soviet Union leader Nikita Khrushchev placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the installation of these missiles brought the USA under the fire from close range for the first time, and it almost doubled the number of bases or cities in the American mainland, which could be threatened by the USSR. When the USA became aware of it, American President John F. Kennedy and his advisors were determined to get Khrushchev to remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba, and Kennedy ordered American warship to intercept any Soviet ship heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USS of its seriousness, and a clash seemed imminent in what came to be known as Cuban Missile Crisis. The arenas of the Cold War: Berlin in 58-62, Korea in 50-53, Congo, Cuba, Vietnam, and Afghanistan in 1979 to 89. The arenas of Cold War refer to the areas where crisis and war occurred or threatened occur between the alliance system but did not cross certain limits, and the Cold War was also responsible for several shooting wars. The two superpowers were poised for direct encounter in Korea, Berlin, and the Congo, and in several other places. Jawaharlal Nehru, one of the key leaders of NAM, played a key role in the mediating between the two Koreas, and the US and USSR decided to collaborate in limiting or eliminating certain kinds of nuclear and nuclear weapons. Stable balance of power. The US and USSR decided to collaborate in limiting certain kinds of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, and starting in 1960s, two sided signed three significant agreements: the Limited Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Anti-Ballistic Treaty. Treaty means the agreement. The chronology: 1947, American President Harry Truman's doctrine about containment of communism, then 48 to 49, Berlin blockaded by the Soviet Union, then 54, defeat of French by Vietnamese, and then signing of Baghdad Pact sent to 55 US sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, construction of Berlin Wall 61, 47 to 52 Marshall Plan, 50 to 53 Korean War, 54 to 75 American intervention Vietnam, 56 to Soviet intervention Hungary, and Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It is Cuban Missile Crisis. 65 American intervention in the Dominion Republic, US President Richard Nixon's visit to China, and then Soviet intervention in Afghanistan from 79 to 89, and 1989 fall of Berlin Wall as well. 91 disintegration of Soviet Union, Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia 68, Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia 79-89, Gorbachev becomes the president of the USSR, begins reform process 1985, and unification of Germany 1990. Now, the Belgrade Summit, a short note. The first non-aligned summit was held at Soviet Yugoslavia's capital Belgrade in 1961, and the summit was attended by 25 member states and supervisors of three other states, and it emphasized on the importance of non-alliance of world peace. And an appeal was done to Soviet Union and America to stop nuclear test, and the elements of this non-alliance were determined here: assertion of following independent foreign policy, opposition of imperialism and colonization, and being independent from any military no military treaty from Soviet Union or America, absence of any military troops from the land of the country, and the Cuban Missile was, we have already read, Cuba was a small island nation and the cost of Soviet Union, and was an ally of Soviet Union also. In 1962, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, placed nuclear missiles in Cuba and faced towards the US. And the installation of these weapons put the US under the fire, and US President John F. Kennedy was reluctant to nuclear war but was determined to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles and nuclear weapons from Cuba in order to save his nation. So Kennedy ordered American warships to intercept the Soviet Union ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning to USSR and its seriousness, and a clash seemed imminent in this. And now let's talk about few hot questions. Why war didn't happen during Cold War due to theory of deterrence? And why did smaller states in the alliance link themselves or any of the superpowers its self-protection and to limit the authority of the other superpower? What was the need of land area of smaller countries to superpowers to make the land areas base of the operation of their weapons and their military? What was the greatest need of non-aligned countries? They needed to be economically more developed and improve the living standards of people by bringing them above poverty line. And what was a major change in nature of non-alignment? Economic issues received more importance. And why did Indian government sign the treaty with the Soviet Union in 71? So that diplomatic and possible military support during the Bangladesh crisis. So why did both the blocs have huge stock of weapons during the Cold War? Cold War did not eliminate rivalries between the two alliances. Mutual suspicion led them to arm themselves to the teeth and to constantly prepare for war, and huge stock of arms was considered necessary for the prevention of occurrence of war. And what were the changes in global politics after Second World War? Very important question. After the Second World War, the two new powers rose to the global stage with the defeat of Germany and Japan, the devastation of European and in many other parts of the world. The United States and USSR became the greatest powers in the world within the ability to influence events anywhere on earth, and the two superpowers were keen on expanding their spheres of influence in different parts of the world. The world was visibly divided between two alliances systems. And what was the chief reason behind the Cold War? The superpowers emerged in the World War. After the Super World War, both the countries wanted to take over the lead, and this was the major cause for the Cold War. Which two ideologies were involved in a conflict during the World War era? It was communism and capitalism. And which organization came into existence in April 1949? It was NATO, and the Warsaw Pact was led by Soviet Union. And which of the following countries were not NATO member? That was India, And the Western Alliance was headed by the United States, and the island country that received both diplomatic and financial aid from Soviet Union was Cuba. There is a picture-based question. Which two countries are depicted in the above given cartoon, USA and Russia, and which countries emerged as a superpower after the end of the Cold War? The USA emerged as a superpower after the end of the Cold War. And what was the outcome of the Cold War? It was like Soviet Union was disintegrated into component republics, and NATO was related to which alliance? It related to the Western Alliance. And the passage based question, the first one is, why did India adopt non alignment? Because national policies and decisions in a free manner and to actively intervene in world affairs to soften Cold War rivalries, and any two reasons for the loss of relevance uh, due to the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the USSR. And how far do you agree that the non alignment has become an international movement? So if I say NAM has become an international movement because it is based on a resolve to democratize an international system, provides an alternative world in order to redress the existing inequalities in various countries and especially the newly independent countries.